I'm Renee Richard, and today I'm standing in the back of St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans in a prayer room that's dedicated to Henriette Delille. She was an African-American woman, free woman of color, that founded the religious order, the Sisters of the Holy Family, over 150 years ago. So join us today as we explore the life and legacy of this holy woman, Henriette Delille. We're here today in the baptistry of the cathedral, and my guest today is Dr. Emily Gagne-Loomis, who is the director of the Archives and Records Center for the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and of course, my former co-host and host of Rouge way back 15 years ago, back in Baton Rouge. So it's great to have you on the show, and it's been so much fun making these shows. This particular baptismal font here is original to the church, and so you were just saying how many of thousands of people,
hundreds of thousands
of people have been baptized right here.
That's right.
Which brings us to today's show.
Yep.
About a very special woman that probably was baptized here.
She would have been baptized right here. Her name was Henriette Delille, and not only was she baptized here, her mother would have been baptized here, as well as her great-grandmother, who was enslaved. And that woman that was enslaved was named Nanette. And she was the slave of Claude Dubreuil. And here, as we've talked about before, there is no discrimination at the baptismal font. So both the enslaved and those that were free people of color, those that were colonists, any walk of life, if you wanted to bring your baby or as an adult come to be baptized, there was no discrimination here, and you were welcomed into the church, you were baptized into the Catholic faith, and it happened right here.
That's amazing. And the time frame that we're talking about, Henriette was born in 1812. So that's 200 years ago.
That is. And what's interesting about Henriette's baptism, of course we have her great-grandmothers that I talked about, Nanette being enslaved, and we have the grandmother and her mother. And the sacramental records during that time period are very difficult because those that were enslaved and then those that were free, when they were first freed, they did not have last names. So it's sometimes it's very hard to find those baptism records. Unfortunately, in Henriette's case, we have not been able to locate her baptism record. But based on her other records, both her funeral record as well as her confirmation and the other records that we do have in the church, we know that she was born about 1812. There was actually a hurricane in 1812, so that may have been some of the reasons why they may have been even displaced and why we can't find it. But we do have her sister's baptism, we have her brother's baptism, and we're able to trace all of the people. We have, actually, there were twins that were also siblings of hers that died as infants, and we're able to trace that. We're able to trace her children that died very early on, and I know we're going to talk about that, young children. And so this baptismal font is extremely important, not only to all New Orleanians, but especially to Henriette and to her. Part of what we research in her cause for canonization would have happened right here.
And she's one of these people that, when we had the show with Father Counts, he talked about, local saints, people that are known regionally, because outside of New Orleans or Louisiana, Baton Rouge, people may not have heard of who Henriette Delille is, but she's the foundress of an order of nuns that are worldwide, correct? She's
the Sisters of the Holy Family.
Sisters of the Holy Family. Their mother house is here in New Orleans, off of Gentilly, I believe. But, they're all over the United States, particularly like Texas and stuff, but aren't they still overseas as well?
They have a ministry over in Benin, which is over in Africa, which they started, so it was almost like coming full circle. But if we go back to Henriette and her beginnings, and we go back to that baptism in 1812. She would have been baptized here. She was born here in the French Quarter on Burgundy Street, just a
Few blocks over.
few blocks over. The Ursuline sisters were still ministering here in New Orleans and in the French Quarter itself. It was before they moved on to Dauphine Street. So she and her siblings would have had this great Catholic experience here and being part of that Catholic faith, being able to worship here in the cathedral, being able to be part of the community. And it's where she would have grown to love Jesus and grown in her own faith as part of being a part of New Orleans. She was born a free woman of color, and as she goes through life, we know that the Ursulines are ministering to people, to African Americans, and to both the enslaved and to people of color. So she would have had an upbringing of learning about her faith.
We were talking in terms of, Henriette's early life, but as she grew up, what were her expectations in terms of being a free woman of color, her state in society versus, being white and free? There's a difference in the culture, is there not?
Or even, yes, or even enslaved.
Enslaved, yeah.
In New Orleans, there was actually a three-tier society. We had the enslaved that were at the bottom tier, who had no freedom, who were not able to move about society. Then we have, at the top level, we would have, or the top tier of being able to do what you wanted to do, you would have had your white people that would have come from colonists that were now part of the United States. So it's 1812, and you've got people that are in that atmosphere. And then you've got a middle tier.
In between.
And that in between are those of free people of color. Some and many, or actually most, were of mixed race. And so they had gained freedom one way or the other. They had either bought their freedom, they had been freed by their masters. They had in some instances been baptized free because the master acknowledged that they no longer wanted to hold them as enslaved. So Henriette was in this middle ground. And as part of that, she was actually 3 generations of the middle ground.
Right.
And we see from her great-grandmother who was enslaved, and then her grandmother, and then her mother, there's a term that we use as historians that's called serial monogamy that another historian actually penned, and that has to do with you were with one man for sometimes your lifetime and sometimes for several years, and you had children by them, and they supported you, supported your children. So it's a life that we hear about within the city of New Orleans. Of course, the time Henriette was growing up, roughly 25% of the city were free people of color.
Okay.
So you had half the city that were white and that had been former colonists. Some now in Americas are coming from somewhere else. And then you have those that were enslaved, and just in the city of New Orleans, those that are enslaved are about 25%. Those that are free people of color are another 25%. So when you look at 29,000 people in town, 14,000 are people that were free people of color. So Henriette was growing up in this type of society. There was freedom in her movement, but there was also rules to what she could still do and couldn't do as a free woman of color.
Do some of those rules involve marriage between the races?
Well, you could not marry within races. You could not. There was always the stance of a white person could not marry someone of color. There was
Which would
that.
explain
That didn't
her
happen until
situation,
after. Right.
But her situation coming up.
Right,
Correct.
right, and we see both in with the free people of color, some of course marry within someone else, a man that would be a free person of color. But oftentimes we also see at this point in time that they would have had a liaison with a white man, a Frenchman, and that's what happens to Henriette. Henriette has a liaison for a very short period of time, and she is extremely young. She's 14
like 15,
years old.
14 or 15.
And her first child is born when she's of that age. Her second child is born when she's about 16. That first child dies when she's 16 and having the second child, and then that second child dies before she's even 18.
You know, and there were other things going on in her life at that time frame that may have contributed to her conversion, correct? She had issues going on with her mother and her sister.
Yes.
All in
yes.
the same time frame that really strained, put
Well, her mom,
a burden on her.
we have just from some of the court papers and stuff, we think that her mom had a bit of mental illness, but we're not sure about any of that. We know that as she got older, there was a time that they said that she was not able to take care of herself. So Henriette would have grown up with that and having to care for her mom. Henriette was the youngest of all of the children. So she was born a little bit later to, of course she has older siblings. And so as she grows up, she has these two children. After those two children die, she does not want to have a liaison with a man, a Frenchman, a Spanish person,
Anybody.
an American, whatever. She decides she does not want that life. She does not want to be taken care of or be engaged by someone else.
Yeah.
So she then decides, she right here, she has her confirmation here in the cathedral. After her confirmation is when she has that conversion. It's about 1836, and she has a tremendous conversion of heart and decides that she doesn't want to live a typical life of a free woman of color. She wants to live as someone that's doing good work for the community. So she decides at that point in time, she starts a women's group of prayer, which is called the Presentation of a Blessed Virgin Mary. And so this is a group of women that are coming together to pray, and that's in 1836. We also see in our records that she's becoming a godmother at that time period. There's some influence by the Ursulines. We know that. We know that she's teaching at the St. Claude School, which is run at the time by the Ursulines, and ministering to people of color, both those that are enslaved and those that are free. So Henriette's already working there. She's working at the school. That school, and that's early on in 1830s, but later on, that school also gets a church, and that church then becomes St. Augustine. That's about the same time when the foundation of St. Augustine is laid in 1841. And they decide that they're going to have a parish church, which is in the Tremé, just right outside the...
Where she's living.
Where she's living, right outside of the French Quarter. And in the Tremé, that's where one of the first parishes. We have a couple of parishes that are beginning outside of New Orleans and outside of the French Quarter. And so this parish is begun. And this parish is a very multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural church. And Henriette is a part of that church. That original group of women, and she and two of her best friends, which is, she begins then, they start the Sisters of the Holy Family. So the foundation for the Sisters of the Holy Family is 1842.
And she had tremendous support
from
here, Roussillon, Reverend Roussillon, who was
He's the
pastor?
Vicar General. He's the Vicar General. He's the first pastor at St. Augustine.
And then also was Antoine Blanc here then?
Antoine Blanc is also,
Again,
yes.
of course, his connection, to our diocese. But
Absolutely.
They were big proponents of helping her because for an African-American woman or women, along with, what Juliette Godin, Josephine, Charles, her two best friends, for them to start this group was not common or not acceptable, but very hard to do.
And they're met with some controversy.
And they did.
No, a lot of controversy.
But they had those two priests in their corner really supporting them to get it off the ground. Am I correct on that?
Oh, that's true. Yeah. That's absolutely true.
She had the support of the people here. Now, she had the support of, the two priests that were here, but they had a very difficult struggle and a lot of challenges in getting off the ground, correct?
They did. They have a house. They've bought a house. Henriette actually has some money, a little bit that she's inherited, and she does buy a house. But then they start taking in some of the elderly, which means they have to move and be in a different house while they start their nursing home.
Right, because she's getting a reputation around in the area of these women that want to help people.
Exactly.
And so they're actually, like, they brought her.
Well, they have 3 goals for the Sisters of the Holy
it.
Family at the time period. That is to work with those that are uneducated, to educate those that did not have education, to minister to the poor, and also to take care of the elderly. Mm-hmm. And they're recognized as one of the oldest nursing homes in the country, which is the LaFawn Nursing Home, that was started back then because they were caring for the elderly that had been enslaved or that were free, and that no one would take care of them. You know, it's sometimes masters did. I mean, it was already cruel to be enslaved, but then when you were no longer of service, they would just throw you out because you couldn't do anything anymore for them to help with whatever they were doing, whatever cause that they had for making money as an enslaved person. So the sisters took these people that had been enslaved all of their lives and that were now elderly and no one would care for, and they cared and ministered to these people, which is just an incredible way of working to help the people that were so underserved in the community.
That's it. And they really worked for years trying to get established as an order.
Mm-hmm. And Henriette used her money to be able to do that. The money that she not only inherited, as I said, from her mother, but also she would have gotten some other money from different people. People knew that this was a good cause. They actually would donate to them. The sisters were known to go out and beg for help and to get some money to be able to continue. They would eat very little in order to be able to feed everyone else. And so even when Henriette, we have a picture of Henriette. It's the only picture we have of her. It's taken about 1860, and people will ask me, how do you know that? Well, this one card of hers, which is a carte de visite, it's very small. It looks like a baseball card.
Right.
I mean, it's literally the size
like
of a baseball card. And on one side, it gives us who the photographer is. His name is, we just have an A in front of it, and Constant, Constant, C-O-N-S-T-A-N-T. Well, when we did some research about him, he arrives in the city in 1857, and he does this specific type of photography until the 1870s. Well, Henriette dies in 1862. So it's really easy to go, okay, so he was on a street that ran next to, in the French Quarter, and Rousselon, who you mentioned earlier, actually the same photographer had just taken a picture of Rousselon. So Etienne Rousselon, Father Etienne Rousselon. And so you're then going, okay, did Father Rousselon then look at her and go, okay, you're going to take your picture now, and pick, and say, you've got to go take a picture. We have to have a picture of you, because she had started this order. Well, so we can figure out then, they took it somewhere between 1858, when the photographer is here. Henriette dies in 1862. She dies of consumption, which
is tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis. So we know she's very ill the last year or so of her life. So it's probably about 1860. Yeah. Okay, so she then, when you start looking at her life, she's not in a habit that we would know of as a habit. She was not allowed to take a habit, because at that point in time, there were people that did not want the Sisters of the Holy Family to actually wear what we consider as a traditional habit of sisterhood. Yeah. And so that is, she's in almost like a widow.
The widow's outfit.
She's got her rosary around her neck. She's got a small white collar. She's in a black robe or navy blue robe. She's standing in what we see is a really interesting, typical stand next to a chair or a column or a furniture. So it's this whole posed area for her. And you get to really see what she looked like at that time period. And she dies just 2 or 3 years later. So it's a really good piece, and we know that that's her, and we know that it's a great piece to have. We've had it on exhibit before, and the sisters, that's one of their treasured pieces, is to actually have a picture of that early of Henriette, from the beginning.
They had her prayer book that had her.
They did.
That had her.
I believe in God. I
what do they
want
call
to serve
that?
and love God. Yes.
Their mantra.
Yes. And she writes. There's a little bit that her actual writing was destroyed during Hurricane Katrina, but we had a picture of that before.
Good.
We also have some of the prayer books and the library of the Sisters of the Holy Family that the sisters have, but we know from working with that collection that a lot of it is written to, it was the collection of Etienne Roussillon. So again, Father Roussillon would have been giving them books, things to study. We know that one of their earliest books comes from the Ursulines and how to work with students and those that are living with you as boarders. And so there's a lot that they're getting. And we know from that early library of theirs what kind of education they had. Her best friend, Juliette Godin, we know was a reader, because most of the books that are in the with the Sisters of the Holy Family, those early ones, have her name in them. And they will have two. They'll have Etienne Roussillon from the library of Etienne Roussillon, and then Juliette will sign her name. So they are very learned women, very Catholic, of course, very faithful, very much doing the work of what needs to be done for people that are being so underserved here in the city.
The good that this holy woman is doing up until the end of her life, what happened to what she started, the order that she started after she died?
Well, after she died, so she dies in 1862, and she's buried in St. Louis No. 2, the cemetery there. And then the order, both Juliette Godin and then Josephine Charles, both become, in succession, the head of the order. And the order for a time goes through some shrinking of the sisters, and then it has this tremendous period of growth. What's really interesting about their shrinking, and after the Civil War, there's a small story that is with the sisters, and it talks about, at that time period, whether they would accept someone that had been enslaved as a sister. Could they then become a sister of the Holy Family? Because originally it was free people of color, and so they were more educated, obviously, than those that were enslaved. So how do they balance all of that? And so there was some tension at the time about whether or not to take someone that wanted to become a sister that had been enslaved, and they worked through that process. And by the 1880s or so, the sisters then have a habit, that is designed by, I think, Josephine Charles.
I think so.
And so they've moved along. By the 1900s, they are growing. They are beginning to move out all over the United States.
Right, we have them in Baton Rouge.
Yes,
St. Francis Xavier Church is run by this order.
And they move even to Belize, which was British Honduras at the time, and they start in an area there, they start a mission there, and so they're continuing to grow. And they've started schools, they're ministering in parishes. They are really growing. They're in Texas, they're in Oklahoma, they're in California, they're up the East Coast. You see just this migration of sisters doing great work all over and being able to minister, because after the Civil War, the Catholic Church starting African American parishes, and so to be able to do that and to have schools for African Americans, for the children, they have to have people that would minister there. And so the sisters, that's where their calling is. Their calling is to go out and do that all over the United States. So they have this great swell of people both joining and everything that they're doing out in the United States, and again, as I said, in Belize. By the 1980s or so, actually, I think it's the 70s, they go even to Africa. So it's a different, and I might actually have my date wrong on that, so I don't have my notes in front of me.
I just say when.
But
the point is,
yes, in the late 1900s, they go back to Africa and they start a mission in Benin. So it's this full circle of the sisters who had been of African American descent, who are going back to Africa to minister, to start a different order, and then to come back here.
So when did the process for her to be recognized or to start the road towards sainthood
Sure.
began?
So,
Because we're
the
running out of
cause for
time. There's still so much to
canonization, I
talk
know.
about with her.
So the cause for canonization starts in 1989, that Archbishop Schulte decides that he really wants to open this cause. And it's with the Sisters of the Holy Family that want to open the cause. And they have to have, of course, the support from the Archbishop. But you know, whenever you go through this process, there is a tremendous amount of research that has to be done. So my predecessor, Dr. Charles Nolan, is the one that starts that. He's part of the Historical Commission. Father Cyprian Davis, who was a very well-known Catholic historian of African American history and Black Catholic history, and they start to gather all of this evidence. I, at the time, later on, am in Baton Rouge, and one of the really interesting parts for me as they start trying to figure out who Henriette's father is. I have done research on a man who happened to be in my family, and his name is Jean-Baptiste Lille Sarpi. And through my research of him coming in one direction and the Catholic Church and my predecessor, Charles Nolan, coming in the other direction, we were able to substantiate better who her father is. Her father, Jean-Baptiste Lille, L-I-L-L-E, Sarpi. Lille was his nom de plume or his nickname or deep name, as we talk about in the French stuff. He comes from a little town in Fromelles, France. He actually, de Lille, which is why we get Henriette de Lille, because she's from Lille, which is why she doesn't have the last name Sarpi. So all of this research comes together, and all this research then is promoted and sent to Rome.
Where she was unanimously.
Right. Rome then recognizes her as a servant of God and then makes her venerable because they've looked at all of the information that we have, and they know that this woman lived a life of virtue, of heroic virtue in what she's done and what she continues to do. We are now looking for and praying for those miracles. There are miracles that have been presented to the Vatican and to the doctors of the Vatican, and some of them look extremely promising as far as being miracles, which would be just absolutely fantastic to have someone that was born here in the city of New Orleans, that was a woman of African American descent, that was a free woman of color, that was Creole, that is now being promoted to sainthood. We have one more step that would be blessed, which would be one miracle. 2 miracles would then make her a saint. Any of those, when she is, if she becomes a saint, when she is canonized, that will actually happen here at the St. Louis Cathedral. So we are thrilled. We keep praying, we keep hoping. We know that there are people out there that are being cured and that are receiving tremendous graces through the intercession of Henriette de Lille.
Yes, and I mean, her life is just amazing. So we're just about out of time, but Lee, thank you for being on the show and
You're welcome.
Helping us, all of us and our viewers, to understand more about this wonderful holy woman that lived here in New Orleans. Join us again for another episode of Roots of Faith.